So we start. And the question is, should we learn about how to do IP from the military? And the reason you might think to do it is because, everybody's always talking about IP strategy. And the word strategy actually comes directly from the military because the word Greek, the word general in Greek is strategos. And there's also a lot of academic study. And therefore, the natural inclination is that we can learn from the military about how IP should be used. But in fact, IP is not a military art, and the goals of using IP are very different from the goals of the military. And what I'd like to do today is, what's called compare and contrast. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is by talking about differences, but then taking a recognized body of military theory called Principles of War and see if it is or is not relevant. Now, there's no question that part of my argument is a straw man argument because, it's a very complicated question to answer. But I do hope that the general flavor will get across. And just to be clear, I'm not distinguishing between battle and war. And one of the reasons I'm not distinguishing is because most people don't distinguish. And also, IP does not stand alone. IP is part of some sort of business thing. But I'm not going to talk much about business. I'm going to talk about using IP in the context of business. So the first difference, perhaps, between IP and military is destruction. And here's a quote from a Japanese book called Principles of War. And it says, the essence of warfare is power, to crush the opponent's power of resistance, to cause him to submit, to destroy the opponent's fighting power. Okay, the word destroy appears in several different variations here. Now, I'm admitting that the military does things in additional to just war. But like I said, that's what people talk about. Now, IP is not about destruction. People's lives are not at stake. And while IP does want to help you control the market or maybe control the money flow, it usually does not do it by destruction. In fact, IP has a very rich non-destructive side having to do with collaboration, transactions, licensing, things like that. So if we just compare how they do it, war controls people, the people's will, often by controlling their land, and most often by destroying their ability to resist you. In IP, destroying somebody's ability to resist is not that common. What they do have in common has to do with controlling the will of the other side. We want to use IP in order to cause our opponents to become our partners and our potential opponents to decide not to become opponents. So that is common, but it's not destruction. A second difference is, do you use IP against IP? In the military, if I have an army and you have an army, so my army will shoot in your army and your army will shoot in my army. But with IP, it's not like that. Maybe battles between brands are direct attacks. Or if I have 100 patents and you have 100 patents, So we have, like in mutually assured destruction, I'm not going to sue you and you're not going to sue me. But usually, IP is used against marketing or sales activities. IP is used against R&D activities. You can fight IP by asking to cancel the IP. What you don't do is use a patent against another patent, except, very rarely. So the tools that you use in order to diminish IP are very different from the tools that you use in order to apply IP. And in warfare, there's the same. Now, just you'll see I'm not completely out of it. It is true that the military has lots of different tools. And if you have mines and you have a minesweeper, they're not used, they're not equivalent. But in IP, the contrast is much higher. What you use IP for and what you use against IP are not very related. Another issue is the criticality of IP. Now, I think IP is wonderful and you can do incredible things with it, but a company without IP is not always dead in the water. Well, if you have a war going on and one of the sides does not have a military and does not have allies with the military, then very often the war is lost. Not always, but very often. And in fact, this is usually the goal of battle, which is to destroy the other side's military. But in business, you have lots of tools that you can use. For example, for competitive advantage, you don't have to use only IP. You can prevent copying, not only using IP. People can license your technology, even if it's not protected using IP. People collaborate all the time without IP. Companies exist, I don't know how, but they do, without IP. In general, the importance of IP is different for different companies. And in some companies, what's really most important from their IP perspective is how not to infringe somebody else's patent. And, execution companies that have a competitive advantage because they do better execution. So they do have IP, but they don't use it against anybody else. Another difference is that IP is not mobile. So when you have a war, ships, airplanes, soldiers, tanks can move from one place to another. They can threaten different places. But IP usually can't. So even in the case that you wrote a broad patent that has multiple inventions in it and you're in the middle of prosecution and you can change the scope of your claims, you're still stuck with what was written in the original IP. So you have some limited movement, but it's pretty limited. Variants do evolve over time, and when you file new IP, you have to file it somewhere else. What this means is that while military also do a lot of pre-planning, in IP, it is super important to decide ahead of time where you might have conflict with somebody else. Because if you get it wrong, you can't just say, oh, I have this patent on electric widgets. Let's change the patent into a patent on hydraulic widgets. Can't do that. And luckily, I don't know, in IP, the time that you plan ahead can be much more than you do in battle. Moving soldiers from one place to another can happen in hours or days. But planning new IP or knowing when you're going to need to use that IP can often be decades ahead of time. On the plus side, IP has very few logistics issues. You don't have to feed IP, you don't have to give it more ammunition and whatnot. IP acts slowly. So if you look at a battle, you have commander fatigue. meaning the guy who's supposed to make decisions can get tired, can get confused. IP usually moves very slowly, which means if something happens, you have a whole month to respond to it. You can sleep at night. You can call up 4 different patent attorneys to get advice. A possible exception is when you're in trial and people are talking, or doing all proceedings, then you have to move quickly. But other than that, it doesn't happen. It's true that the business world doesn't usually know how to make fast decisions, but we're still not talking about within an hour. What that means is that in military affairs, there's a big issue of shock and a big issue of surprise. In IP, the type of surprise you can have is, I was planning to do A, and I set everything up for A, but now I can't because my opponent surprised me. What doesn't happen is that the surprise shocks you and you don't know how to respond. On the other hand, the shape of the land, mountains, rivers, and so on, in military affairs, doesn't change that quickly or that much. But in IP and in business, things can change very quickly. The shape of the terrain, what the market looks like, what the customers expect, these things can change relatively quickly. Another thing having to do with speed, IP can collapse much faster than military forces. Yes, military forces can collapse in a day. But with IP, if suddenly it turns out you don't own the patent, that's it. It's over. If a killer prior art comes out, settlement might happen the next day. It could happen in military, but it's less common. And one way to look at it is that military battles are an event or a crisis, but IP is a gradually evolving state. It changes slowly over time. You can have a crisis, but the crisis is usually not, from today to tomorrow. Another big difference, talked about IP not being about destruction. IP usually wins by avoiding battle. Okay, so there's all sorts of numbers for what percentage of patents get to court, what percentage finish litigation without settlement. The answer is most patents are used without getting to court. And everybody loves doing design around, and design around is exactly how you don't do battle. And I want to contrast it to military, and especially during the Middle Ages, but even we have an example from the Bible. One of the jobs of the military is to force the other side to come together so they can have a head-to-head battle, and one side is going to win. Now, everybody likes quoting Sun Tzu about subduing the enemy without fighting is highest skill possible. I have a link here to an article that says that probably the correct translation from Chinese is not that, but rather without having a pitched battle, face to face. But there are other Chinese thinkers which talk about winning without fighting. But having said that, most military events have to do with battle, and when people want to copy ideas from the army, they don't say, let's avoid battles the way the military avoided battle. They say, we're going to attack with our patents, and we're going to block with this patent, and so on. IP is not a significant expenditure. I have here 2 countries. 17% of government spend in Iran is apparently military, 12% in Israel, somebody else's numbers, as of last year. R&D expenditures, I wrote down between 10 to 15%. For some companies, it's much less, like I heard Apple is 5%. The IP expenditure is much less than 1% of the revenue. But not only money, people, work hours, lab time, management attention, all of these are much smaller, relatively speaking, than military budgets, which means that if a company wanted to increase its IP effort by a factor of 3, 4, 10, they probably could. No country is able, with these numbers, to make its army 10 times the size. Okay, it's not possible. I want to focus specifically on people. Military is a lot about controlling large numbers of people and some sort of complex hierarchy, and you have a general and you have assistants and so on. The IP department isn't always small. In Qualcomm, it's probably not that small, so I couldn't find exact numbers on how many tens of thousands they have. But in most companies, the IP department is between small and very small. And it's also a pretty flat hierarchy, and controlling the people is not so important. The individuals in the company affect the IP. They have to be on board, but you don't really have to control them. It also means that if the general calls up the president of the country, the president will listen. If the IP guy will call up the CEO, fewer people involved, less money, probably get less attention. Perhaps IP department is a bit like the real estate department. Most of the value is in the real estate or in the IP, and you have a small number of people managing it to help it happen. Another very important difference is that IP and military have very different opponents in mind. Okay, of course, it's not just opponents, it's also collaborators. But usually when you have a battle, you know who you're fighting. We have the enemy, the Axis. But in IP, you prepare the IP when you don't know who your opponents are going to be. There's usually multiple opponents, some of which exist, some don't exist. Some of them you want to prevent from existing. What exactly and where exactly you're going to fight is less clear because markets change. So what it is that you want to do. So IP is much less focused in who it's attacking. And last but not least, how flexible are you in your goals? So it started off by the military wanting to defeat the enemy, and it defeats it usually by destroying the army. While in business, it's not about the other side. It's about you. Can you help your company succeed? Your company can succeed in lots of ways. It can stream videos and it can send DVDs by mail. Whichever works is fine. In fact, you might start with one and have to change to another. Even if you lose a battle, it's often not a defeat, but actually some type of win-win solution. The other side, of course, wins more, but by working together, you create more value and there's more to give up. And unfortunately, IP, the goals can be flexible, but old IP puts on you constraints that you don't have in the military. Brute force. Okay, people who don't have money say you have to write good, smart patents. People that don't have clever strategists say you have to have a big army and brute force. But the army usually can't do without brute force. While IP, usually you can't apply brute force. Okay, let's say I have 10 patents and you're infringing all 10 of my patents. The only thing I can do is go to court and have the court apply force on you. Besides the fact that it takes time and money and who knows who's going to win, some companies practice, efficient infringement, meaning they say, if we lose, it'll take 5 years and we'll pay $2 billion. We're going to make $10 billion. We're going to infringe. So some types of IP, like patents, don't apply much force, which means that you have to be smart in using IP for leverage. Now, there's a concept in the military called the indirect approach. I will summarize it by saying that the indirect approach seems to have more to do with moving around and with having a certain type of psychological effect on your opponent, neither of which appear to be very relevant in IP, but feel free to learn about it. So what I've done until now is given you multiple different dimensions where IP is, I think, clearly different from the military. But in order to test what I just said, there's something called the principles of war. And I mentioned a Japanese book called Principles of War, and I have a quote on top from the UK Defense Doctrine, 5th edition, and from Carl von Clausewitz. Okay. And what happens is people put together principles in order to help make sense of what's happening. And over the years, it's been accepted, and I'll show you in a second. It's not uniformly accepted agreement, but there appear to be principles that people believe in. And one of the principles, which is not listed, but it's important to put it down, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Meaning, if you're not willing to risk anything, you're probably not going to get very far. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to give you each one of these 10 principles and show you whether or not it applies to IP. And I'm noting that people are always suggesting new principles, and I'm not going to talk about them. And just to be clear, in case a military person is listening, these principles, in order to explain what happened, they don't tell you what to do or how to do them. Each principle, we can give examples of winning because of or in spite of ignoring the principle, or losing because of or in spite of ignoring the principle. So, grain of salt. Here's a table from a paper quoted on the previous page. And you see we have on top 9 different countries, and each one of them has principles of war. And they're similar, not exactly the same. I've related mainly to Great Britain, but from time to time, I've stuck in something about US, Israel, or the Soviet Union. Okay. First principle. And each one of the principles, I give you a quote from the UK doctrine, and then I talk about it with respect to IP. First principle is you have to have an aim, focus, coordinated effort, efficient, people can contribute, and so on. So IP is slower, so we can expect the goals to change much faster than the IP. And that's a plus because it means that your IP can be governed by changes in your company goals. If you have a startup company and you build your IP portfolio according to a single goal, you're pretty likely to fail. And the reason is because startup companies are a search process. They're exploring what it is they're going to do, even if all they're doing is looking for product market fit. So you don't even know exactly what your goal is. Now, I personally disagree with ideas that you should have a single goal. because there's lots of ways of winning, and IP is cheap, so you should really spend it on multiple goals. Offensive action. In IP speak, offensive action appears to be litigation. Litigation is expensive and disruptive and often not very decisive. People like avoiding it, they like threatening you, but they don't like suing you. But much worse than that, IP is by nature defensive. Of course, you can do much more, but there is a reason why people always say, I want to protect what I'm doing using IP. Okay, even if you can do other things with IP and should be doing other things. Offensive action usually means that you want to have a monopoly. Do you really want a monopoly? The military, as it moves around, it weakens, usually, not always. But the military itself is anti-fragile. Anti-fragile means that when you stress it, it becomes better. So if you have military and it goes to battle and it loses 10% of its force, it can become better because the 90% to the left now have more experience in working under fire. IP doesn't move much, and it also changes strengths when it's used. Every time you use IP, it becomes weaker and narrower and so on. I think that this principle could be replaced by a principle called proactive. Use your IP proactively, but offensively, not so much. Concentration of force. All I can say is that while Napoleon loved concentration of force, defensive action and static situations is a big problem to try to have concentration of force. Why? Because your opponent can see where you're concentrating your forces and then either plan how to beat you or simply design around. It's not to say that when you do certain IP activities, like blocking a critical feature or suing somebody, you're not going to use a concentration of IP. But being defensive, you're probably going to have a lot of IP, which you can't move around and can't concentrate. Related, economy of force. I already just said that most of your IP won't be relevant in most of the situations. IP is easy to damage, and you can't send IP on a short vacation to regain their strength. There's more uncertainty in IP, so sometimes you need an overkill. A lot of your IP will not be used for any particular battle. And instead of this principle of economy of force, in China, they talk about mobility, which I already mentioned before, it's not so relevant for IP. And in Israel, they talk about optimum utilization of forces, which is also much less relevant for IP because most of your IP can't be used at any given time. Flexibility. IP is typically centrally controlled, by the IP department. So you usually don't have separate units that can apply IP by themselves. Because IP is small, the number of people involved is small, there's not a lot of room for distributed initiative. And if you do have distributed initiative, let's say you have profit litigation in China and litigation in Germany, if there's any incoherence between what you're telling the courts and how you're interpreting your patents and the prior art, that could be the end of you. So you can't provide this type of flexibility that you're looking for. IP, once it's granted, like patents or trademarks even, so they have more designs, not flexible. You have what you have, you can make some changes, but that's it. As other formulations, maneuver, tempo, mobility, they all have the same problem. In Israel, we have a different concept called continuity of action, which means that once you engage the enemy, you don't let up. Yeah, we don't see it in the news today. But once you engage the enemy, you don't let up and you chase them. IP timetables, like I said before, it's very difficult to knock your competitor out of kilter because he has days, weeks, or even months to think about what's going on. And I do want to make a note, this is a modern principle of war, but in ancient warfare, when communication was bad, usually you set up the battle ahead of time and then you sat back and watched because there was very little you could do. So it used to be that flexibility in battle was not really an issue. Cooperation, called unity of command in other places, absolutely relevant for IP. I mentioned that IP is weak, which means that IP needs to cooperate with as many corporate functions as possible. Doesn't happen as often as we'd like, but that's what you need. Just as a reminder, some activities are bad. For example, marketing, if done wrong, can quickly damage your IP. And if done right, using cooperation, you can have a synergistic effect. But the question we'll always ask is, who is providing this unity of command to make sure that IP and marketing work together? I don't have an answer. Security. You have to make sure that your army doesn't get harmed. Absolutely an issue in IP. IP is a very sensitive item. And like I said before, you can't repair it. It's more than that. Some things in IP you can only use once, and you can't replenish them because you can't go back in time. You can do some partial replenishment by buying IP from other people. And what's going to happen in the future? We don't know, but we do know that more companies will appear to be your opponents as you win. In war, you can perhaps hope that once you beat your main enemy, you'll have peace, for 10, 20 years. Surprise. I mentioned before surprise, but here they actually say it. It limits our opponent's reaction time by affecting the ability to make decisions. Well, I mentioned in IP, that's not very common. It is true that if you surprise somebody, then they might not have time to do activities, decisions they can make, but they can't do activities. So surprise does have meaning also when you do IP. In Israel, the concept is stratagem. And I believe stratagem and its close cousin deception are critical for IP because IP is static and it's not flexible. So how do you make sure that it catches your opponent? Either you hide it so your opponent steps on it by mistake, or you attract him towards your IP. That means that the stratagem not only makes your IP more effective, it also makes your IP more relevant, and it also makes your IP more likely to survive. If your opponent doesn't know that this is relevant IP, then your opponent won't try to cancel your IP ahead of time. Logistics. Huge problem in the military. Napoleon said, the army marches on its stomach. IP has no line of supply. You just need a little bit of money in order to maintain your IP position. Maybe keep your trade secrets carefully and so on. It means that it's very difficult to block an IP line of communication. IP, can jump around, can suddenly appear somewhere. So the comparative fear in IP is not that you lose contact with your logistic base, but the opposite, a killer event which eviscerates your IP. Suddenly prior art appears in the middle of your IP and it's dead. Or it suddenly turns out that the IP belongs to somebody else and you can't use it. Last principle, maintenance of morale. IP doesn't have many people. Usually the morale that you need to maintain is that of decision makers that are not used to how IP works and the threats involved. You need to make sure that they know everything's, okay. One of the things you should be doing is building an IP culture in the decision makers so that they understand, what's going on and don't lose morale. Us IP people are usually more timid, I'm using that word instead of coward, and much more reliant on preparing ahead of time and less action-oriented and less competitive. And that often turns into being less interested in going into IP battles and so on. So the ones who need to have their morale maintained are the IP people. Okay, so these were the 10 principles of war. And here's a few concepts which are not principles, but are well recognized as being common in war. There's a fog of war. Nobody knows what's going on. There's friction, which means that when you try to do something, it's really difficult to do. Both of these are very common in IP. There's hurry up and wait, also phrased as military service is 99% boredom and 1% abject terror. So in IP, most of the time, nothing is happening. And other concepts like exploitation, attrition, initiative, they definitely, IP has what to learn from them. You might ask yourself, so should IP people learn anything from the military? Most of the principles do not apply. The major differences between the two, clearly, anybody using military metaphors is a suspect. But one thing that IP and military have in common is that both of them try to create power. In both of them, you use a context and information about the opponent, and there's always an opponent, hopefully to identify leverage points and apply force or threat or, positive stuff in order to bend the will of people on the other side. The master, be it grand strategy or business strategy, is usually different. You want to win, but winning, is different things. You could have the equivalent of soft power. And I also am giving you a quote here from the Russian book on principles of victory in combat, that the most important thing is to understand what's going on and what your opponent might do. And for that, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the enemy and figure out their strengths and weakness and their intentions and predict the future action. That is 100% correct for IP. Now, for completion, because I had to choose something, so I chose the principles of war, but there are alternative theories of warfare, like the not destruction, like intimidation, exhaustion, and subversion, which are definitely relevant for IP. There's a Chinese 36 stratagems, which are from the classical era, but appear to be relevant to IP. And I think that IP deserves its own set of principles, but maybe we'll leave it for a different day. To give you an example of how you might want to apply these things, if you remember from the very beginning, I said that the principles exist in order to help people make sense of what's going on. So here we have a classic situation of battle between a pizza company and Roboso, and it could be very helpful to take principles of war and ask, we know there's going to be a battle between these two companies. How can we use these principles of war in order to understand what the battle is going to look like? Okay, I am done with my part of the presentation, and I'm stopping the recording now.